The forest was eerily silent, save for the rhythmic crunch of leaves beneath Claire's boots. The air was sharp with the bite of autumn, carrying the crisp scent of pine and damp earth. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself as she quickened her pace, the dim glow of the setting sun casting elongated shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the path. Then she heard it, a sound just beyond the tree line, a soft, deliberate rustling. Not the erratic scurry of a small animal, but something heavier, something to watch. Claire froze. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't alone. Claire turned sharply, breath catching in her throat. There, at the edge of the trees, stood a large German shepherd, half hidden by the undergrowth. Its thick coat gleamed with an untamed ruggedness, but it wasn't its size that sent a shiver down her spine. It was its eyes. A piercing amber, steady and unblinking, locked onto hers with an intensity that rooted her to the spot. The dog didn't growl. It didn't retreat. It simply stared, waiting. Claire's mind raced. She was deep in the wilderness, miles from the nearest town. There were no homes nearby, no hikers she'd passed all day. The dog looked healthy, too well fed to be a stray, but too alone to belong to anyone close by. Was it lost? Abandoned? If it meant harm, it would have attacked by now. And yet, something in its stillness unsettled her. She should turn away. But she didn't. A gust of wind surged through the trees, shaking the branches with an eerie whisper. Claire shivered, her fingers instinctively gripping the straps of her backpack. The forest darkened by the second, the sun's final light bleeding out into the horizon. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to turn back and forget she ever saw the dog. But she couldn't shake the feeling. She wasn't meant to walk away. Without a sound, the German shepherd turned. No hesitation, no backward glance. It simply slipped into the shadows of the forest, its form disappearing between the trees. Claire exhaled, unsure whether to feel relieved or disappointed. Then, deep in her gut, something stirred. Curiosity? Instinct? Or something else? Before she could talk herself out of it, she took a step forward, then another. And then, against all reason, Claire followed. Claire's breath quickens as she pushes forward, the German shepherd weaving effortlessly through the tangled undergrowth ahead. The forest is growing darker by the second, the towering trees pressing in around her, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. Each step takes her deeper into the unknown, further from the safety of her cabin. The ground beneath her boots is uneven, littered with damp leaves and jagged roots. A part of her screams to stop, to turn back before it's too late, but she doesn't. Something about the dog's purposeful stride keeps her moving forward. As she follows, Claire studies the dog more closely. Its fur, once thick and regal, is now matted with dirt and brambles. Beneath the dust, she catches the faint outline of ribs, not yet starving, but lean, hardened by struggle. This animal has been out here for a long time, surviving, fighting. It moves with certainty, its tail neither wagging nor tucked. This isn't just a lost pet, it's something more, a guide, a warning, or something else entirely. Claire swallows, her curiosity tangled with uncertainty. A cold wave of doubt grips her. What if she's walking into danger? She's alone, miles from any road, no phone signal, and she's following an animal she knows nothing about. Fear prickles at the edges of her mind. She glances over her shoulder. The way back is shrouded in shadow. If she turns now, she can still make it home before full dark. But as she looks ahead, the German shepherd pauses, casting her a steady, almost expectant gaze. Claire's throat tightens. Turn back, or trust. Just as she's about to retreat, the silence is broken. A sound, small, fragile, barely more than a whisper, drifts through the trees. Claire stiffens. It's not the rustling of leaves or the call of an animal, it's human. A child's whimper, weak and full of exhaustion. Her pulse kicks into overdrive. A child? Out here? She turns wildly, scanning the endless forest, but sees nothing. Just darkness creeping in, swallowing the last remnants of light. Then she hears it again. Fainter this time, but undeniably real. The German shepherd snaps to attention, its body tense like a coiled spring. Its ears twitch, pinpointing the sound, and then, without hesitation, it bolts. Not aimless, not lost. It knows exactly where it's going. Claire's hesitation vanishes, adrenaline surging through her veins. Whatever is out there, whatever has this animal so determined, she has to find out. She takes a deep breath, her legs trembling as she sprints after the dog, her heart pounding in her ears. Claire crashes into a small clearing, nearly stumbling over an exposed root. And then she sees him. A little boy, no older than 5, half buried beneath a mess of broken branches. His tiny frame barely moves, his breaths shallow, his face streaked with dirt. His lips tremble as if whispering something too faint to hear. Tears have dried on his cheeks, his eyes swollen and red. Claire's chest tightens. He's alone. How long has he been out here? She drops to her knees, her hands hovering, unsure where to touch, afraid of hurting him. The German shepherd circles protectively, a quiet whimper in its throat. Claire swallows hard. This just became life or death. Claire's breath comes in ragged gasps as she kneels beside the unconscious boy, her fingers trembling as she presses them against his cold skin. His frail body barely moves, his breaths shallow, almost imperceptible. Panic claws at her chest. How long has he been out here? Beside her, the German shepherd stands rigid, its sharp eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. Every sound, a rustling leaf, a distant snap of a branch, sends its ears twitching. Claire forces herself to focus. She gently brushes the dirt from the child's face, noting the scratches and bruises marring his skin. "You're okay, buddy," she whispers, more to herself than to him. "You're going to be okay." But deep down, doubt gnaws at her. The cold is unforgiving, and they're still miles from help. Her hands shake as she yanks her phone from her pocket, barely managing to hit the emergency call button. Nothing. Her stomach drops. She checks again. No service. "No, no, no, come on," she mutters, lifting the phone higher, willing for a single bar to appear. But the screen remains lifeless. Claire swallows hard. She's cut off. No way to call for help. A glance at the boy tells her she doesn't have time to wait for a miracle. His skin is too pale, his breath's too faint. If she doesn't move now, he won't make it. Bracing herself, she slides her arms beneath his tiny body, gathering him against her chest. "I'll get you home," she promises. Just as she shifts the boy's weight, a soft whimper breaks the silence. The German shepherd steps closer, its nose brushing against the child's limp hand. A low whine escapes its throat, ears flattened in distress. Claire's heart clenches. "This isn't just any stray," she murmurs, watching the way the dog refuses to leave the boy's side. There's a connection here, an unspoken bond stronger than mere circumstance. She meets the dog's deep brown eyes, seeing the silent plea in them. "We'll take care of him," she assures, adjusting her grip on the boy. The dog gives a small huff, as if acknowledging her words. Then its ears snap forward, its body suddenly rigid. A low, guttural growl rumbles from the shepherd's throat. Claire freezes. The dog's body tenses, hackles raised, eyes locked onto the darkness beyond the trees. A wave of dread washes over her. She holds her breath, straining to hear. At first, nothing, only the whisper of wind through the trees. But then, something shifts. A crunch, faint but deliberate. Something, or someone, is out there. Her arms tighten around the boy. The shepherd's growl deepens, a silent warning. Claire swallows hard. She doesn't want to know what's lurking. "We have to go," she whispers, forcing her feet to move. The shepherd falls in step beside her, never looking away from the shadows. The night presses in around them. Claire's pulse hammers in her ears, the weight of the boy growing heavier with each step. The forest is eerily still now, as if holding its breath. Every instinct screams at her to run. She glances at the shepherd. The dog moves with precise control, ears forward, muscles coiled, ready to strike. It knows something she doesn't, but she has no choice. She has to trust it. Taking a steadying breath, Claire steps forward into the unknown. The shepherd moves first, leading the way, its body tense with purpose. They can't afford to look back. The journey is brutal. Claire's legs burn as she stumbles over roots and uneven ground, the boy's limp forming a constant weight against her chest. Her breaths come in short, exhausted gasps. The shepherd stays ahead, forging a path through the thick underbrush, glancing back every few steps to ensure she's still following. "Almost there," she whispers, though she doesn't know if she's reassuring the boy, the dog, or herself. The child whimpers in his sleep, his fingers weakly gripping her jacket. She tightens her hold on him, just a little farther. The shepherd suddenly stops, tail high, ears forward. Then, Claire sees it. A break in the trees. Her cabin. Relief floods her. They're almost home. Claire bursts through the cabin door, kicking it shut behind her. She rushes to the couch, gently laying the boy down, wrapping him in thick blankets. Her hands shake as she presses her fingers against his wrist. A pulse. Faint, but steady. A shuddering breath leaves her lips. The shepherd moves beside her, settling down at the boy's feet. Its watchful eyes never leave him. Claire strokes the dog's head. "You never left him," she murmurs. The shepherd leans into her touch, letting out a soft sigh. They still have battles ahead, but for now they are safe. For now, they are together, and somehow that feels like enough. Ethan stirred, his small body trembling beneath the thick blankets. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes clouded with fear and exhaustion. Claire leaned closer, her heart pounding as his tiny fingers grasped the fabric of her sleeve. His lips parted, a whisper barely audible. "Papa." Claire's breath hitched. Ethan's gaze darted around the dimly lit room before settling on her face. The cabin, deep in the woods. His words sent a chill down Claire's spine. She brushed damp strands of hair from his forehead. "Your father's cabin?" she asked gently. Ethan nodded weakly, his grip tightening. The fear in his eyes hadn't faded. It had only shifted. "He was supposed to come get me," Ethan murmured, his voice fragile, as if it would shatter under the weight of his words. Claire's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" "I got lost. I waited, but he never came." Ethan's lips quivered. "He said he'd always find me." Claire swallowed hard. A father wouldn't just abandon his child, which meant only one thing. Something had happened. Was he still out there? Trapped? Injured? Or worse? The weight of uncertainty pressed down on Claire's chest, her mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. A sudden rustling broke the silence. Claire turned, her eyes locking onto shadow. The German shepherd stood near the door, his body tense, his amber eyes burning with urgency. His ears flicked forward, attuned to something beyond the cabin walls. Then, with a sharp bark, he whipped his head toward Claire. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. Shadow didn't move. He just stared, pleading. A shiver coursed through Claire. Shadow had sensed Ethan was in danger before. Now, he was doing it again. Whatever had happened to Ethan's father, Shadow knew it wasn't over. Claire exhaled shakily, glancing at the child in her arms, then at the thick darkness pressing against the cabin windows. It was suicide to go into the forest at night. The terrain was unforgiving, the predators relentless. And yet, "He's waiting for us." Ethan's whisper was barely more than a breath, but it carried the weight of certainty. Claire clenched her jaw. Exhaustion clawed at her, but she pushed it down. If Ethan's father was alive, they had no time to waste. She stood, grabbing her flashlight. The beam wavered as her hands trembled. "Stay close," she murmured. Shadow let out a low growl, an agreement. The cold bit at Claire's skin as she stepped into the night. The flashlight's beam barely pierced the suffocating darkness, casting jagged shadows along the trees. Shadow moved ahead, his muscles tense, his every movement precise. Behind her, Ethan clung to her hand. "It's this way," he whispered. Claire's heart pounded as she followed the child's quiet guidance. Every crunch of leaves underfoot sent ripples of unease through her chest. Something felt wrong. The air was too still, the silence unnatural. But there was no turning back. Not now. Time stretched endlessly. Every step felt heavier, their surroundings pressing in. Then, finally, "There," Ethan whispered, pointing. Through the tangled branches, a structure emerged. The hunting cabin stood like a forgotten relic, its wooden frame sagging under the weight of time. Claire hesitated, her breath clouding in the frigid air. The door was slightly ajar. No light flickered from inside. She stepped forward, her heart hammering. Shadow's low growl rumbled beside her. Something waited inside. She pushed the door open. The stench of damp wood and old sweat filled Claire's lungs as she stepped inside. The weak glow of her flashlight swept across the room. And stopped. A man lay slumped against the far wall, motionless. His clothes were torn, his face pale beneath a layer of grime. Ethan gasped. "Papa!" Claire rushed forward, dropping to her knees. She pressed her fingers to his neck. A pulse, weak but there. Then she saw it. A fallen beam had crushed his leg, pinning him. He had been trapped here, alone for who knew how long. They had found him. But now they had to save him. Claire's mind sharpened. He was alive, but barely. Shadow nudged the man's limp arm, whining softly. Ethan pressed against Claire, his breath shaky. "We have to move him," she whispered, gripping the beam. She pulled. It didn't budge. Her fingers slipped against the damp wood, her muscles trembling with effort. The man stirred, a weak groan slipping past his lips. His eyelids fluttered. "Ethan?" Claire's throat tightened. "He's here. You're safe. But we have to get you out." She glanced at Shadow. "Help me, boy." The shepherd barked once, then latched onto the man's sleeve, tugging with determined strength. Claire braced herself. She heaved against the beam with everything she had. It groaned, but refused to move. Shadow's growls deepened as he tugged, his body straining with effort. The man let out a sharp gasp, his eyes flickering open. Pain twisted his features. "My leg." "We've got you," Claire gritted out. "Just hold on." The weight shifted, just enough. Claire adjusted her grip, her muscles screaming. Then, finally, the beam gave way. The man slumped forward, gasping. Claire caught him before he hit the ground. "We need to go," she panted. Then she heard it. A rustling, low, deliberate. Claire's breath froze. Shadow's ears snapped forward. His body stiffened, his growl turning sharp and dangerous. The underbrush crackled. Whatever was out there wasn't small, and it wasn't retreating. Ethan whimpered, clutching his father's arm. Claire lifted the flashlight, aiming toward the darkness. The light caught movement, a shifting shadow just beyond the trees, watching. Shadow stepped forward, teeth bared. Claire's pulse thundered in her ears. They weren't alone, and whatever was out there, it was coming for them. A sudden flood of light slices through the trees, piercing the endless night. Claire squints, momentarily blinded, before realization slams into her. Help is here. A chorus of voices echoes through the forest, distant but growing closer. Her breath catches, and with the last reserves of her strength, she stumbles forward, waving her arms. Here, over here! Her voice is hoarse, nearly lost in the wind. The underbrush crackles as figures in heavy jackets and bright vests rush toward them. Relief crashes over her like a tidal wave, washing away the fear that had threatened to consume her. They made it. They're not alone anymore. Medics descend upon Ethan's father, their movements swift and practiced. Someone shouts for a stretcher. Another checks his vitals. Claire watches as they stabilize him, the color slowly returning to his face. She exhales sharply, her legs suddenly weak. The adrenaline that had fueled her for hours drains away, leaving only exhaustion in its wake. She stumbles back, collapsing onto a fallen log. Her heart still hammers against her ribs, but for the first time, it's not out of fear. It's the weight of everything, the night, the storm, the impossible journey, finally sinking in. Claire barely notices the cold anymore. The chaos of voices fades into a distant hum as she stares at the ground, her body heavy with exhaustion. Then a familiar warmth presses against her leg. Shadow. The German shepherd sits close, his fur brushing against her, his steady presence grounding her in a way words never could. He doesn't whimper or nuzzle for attention, he just stays, silent, unwavering. Claire lets out a shaky breath and runs her fingers through his thick coat. "We did it," she murmurs. Shadow exhales softly, as if saying, "I know." An officer kneels beside Claire, his voice calm but laced with astonishment. "Ethan and his father were reported missing 3 days ago," he says. "We didn't think anyone could survive this long out here." Claire swallows hard, glancing at Ethan, who clutches her sleeve, eyes heavy with exhaustion. "We barely did." The officer nods. "You made the difference." He gestures toward Shadow, and so did he. Claire looks at the dog beside her, his ears twitching at the sound of his name. Not just a dog, a guardian, a miracle. Shadow isn't just a stray. He never was. Claire watches as Ethan kneels beside him, wrapping his small arms around the shepherd's neck. The dog doesn't flinch. He just rests his chin on the boy's shoulder. None of them would be here without him. Not Ethan, not his father, not even Claire. A rescuer chuckles, shaking his head. Some dogs just have it in them. He knew what he was doing. Claire nods, emotion tightening her throat. Shadow didn't just guide them, he saved them. He was their compass in the dark, their protector, their hope. The rescue team assumes Shadow belongs to Ethan's father. They're already making arrangements, preparing to take him. Claire stiffens. She knew this was coming. From the moment she found him in the woods, there was always a chance he belonged to someone else. Still, the thought of letting him go feels impossible. Shadow has been her anchor through this storm, her silent partner in survival. And now, just like that, he might be gone. She forces herself to look at Ethan, at his father. If Shadow is their dog, she has no right to keep him. But that doesn't make it hurt any less. Just as they start to lead Shadow away, Ethan tugs at Claire's sleeve, his grip desperate. "Wait." She turns, her chest tight. Ethan's voice is small but certain. "Shadow found you first." His words hang in the air, heavier than anyone expects. Even the rescuers hesitate. Shadow stays where he is, ears flicking between Ethan and Claire. Then slowly, he pads forward and presses his nose into Claire's palm. A choice. Claire blinks back tears, her heart swelling. Shadow wasn't just passing through her life, he had chosen her, and she wasn't about to let him go. Ethan and his father spent days recovering, their strength returning little by little. The ordeal had left its mark, but they were alive, and that was enough. Through it all, Shadow remained by Claire's side. He never wandered, never looked back. It was as if he had already decided his place was with her now. The day Ethan's father was finally cleared to leave, he turned to Shadow with deep gratitude. The dog had done more for them than anyone could ever repay. Then, looking at Claire, he made a choice neither of them expected. "Shadow belongs with you now," he said, his voice resolute. "He chose you." Claire felt the weight of those words settle inside her. She had never been the kind of person to let anyone, human or animal, get too close. But Shadow had changed that. She was no longer just an observer, documenting life from behind a lens. She was part of something real, something that had forever altered her path. Weeks later, Claire and Shadow stood at the base of a familiar trail. This time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. She wasn't following anyone's lead. She walked ahead, the dog matching her pace. The wilderness didn't feel empty anymore. With Shadow beside her, she wasn't just searching for a story, she was living one. Not all rescues happen the way we expect. Claire had saved Shadow, given him a home, a chance. But in the end, he saved her too. He had reminded her of trust, of companionship, of what it meant to truly live. And as they walked together, she finally understood. Sometimes the ones we save end up saving us in return.